part of the talk will be David and Rahila, so for people who might be a little bit late, they'll get to hear them. I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon, and I want to thank the National Gallery in particular for hosting this event, and for Goda Aksamatazkaita for organising it for us. I want to give a little bit of a background about Rupert, because some of you might not know what Rupert is, and I say what rather than who, because we're an arts institution, a publicly funded one, which is just outside the city of Vilnius, and our mission is to establish a close cooperation between artists, thinkers, researchers, and other cultural actors from a range of different disciplines and fields in 3 programs that we have. The first is a residency program for which we're very well known internationally, and I see that we have some of the residents in the audience now. Thank you for coming. The Alternative Education Program, which is a 6 to 8 month long program, which is mostly for Lithuanian or Vilnius-based artists and practitioners. Last year we had a number of writers and curators. And the public programs. And all of them are devoted to establishing or creating platforms for conversation, for debate, research and learning. I'm Yates. I'm one of the, I am the curator for the public programs at Rupert. And this year, the programs are guided by a set of ideas around interdependence and care. And we'll talk a little bit more about those terms in the discussion coming up. And these programs for 2020 will include talks, seminars, screenings, and online contributions. So to hear more about our upcoming talks, and we have one on the 3rd of March with Oliver Mould, who wrote a book called Against Creativity. Please do check out our website, Facebook and Instagram pages. I am incredibly happy and excited to have David Rubain and Rahila Gupta here in Vilnius, and it's going to be an invaluable opportunity for all of us to hear these 2 extraordinary people. David actually came to Rupert last year and did a workshop with some of our residents and education participants and members of the public. David is currently the I'm going to say that both of their bios are incredibly illustrious and long, so I'm going to give a little condensed version of them. But so David is currently the chief executive for the Conservatoire of Dance and Drama in the UK. And prior to that, he had been the chief executive of Equality Challenge Unit, which is a policy and research agency funded to advance equality and diversity in the UK further and higher education and research sectors. Before that, he was a practicing solicitor for 21 years and was the Director of Legal Policy at the Equality and Human Rights Commission of Great Britain, following a career in private practice as a partner at and the founder of the Department of Education, Equality and Disability Law at Levine Solicitors. David is also a visiting professor of law at Birkbeck University of London. Rahila Gupta is a freelance journalist, writer and activist, and she's a long-standing member of the Southall Black Sisters, which is a group of black and minority women with years of experience of struggling for women's human rights in the UK. It was founded some 40 years ago, is that right? Yeah, 40 years ago in 1979. It's an extraordinary organisation based in London, and since 1979 has been campaigning tirelessly to highlight and challenge all forms of gender-related violence against women. She is also the chair of the Nihal Armstrong Trust, which provides grants for cutting-edge equipment and services to children with cerebral palsy. Her poems and short stories, as well as her journalism, have been published in several anthologies and different newspapers, including the New Statesman, The Guardian, I think I should pronounce it Aeon, is it Aeon? Aeon, and a very good article that we might touch on here. And she has published and edited several books, including Provoked, the story of a woman who endured severe domestic violence and who killed her violent husband, and she co-wrote the screenplay of that film, of a film based on that text, which was released in 2007. She's also published the book Enslaved, which is on immigration controls, and which was also published in 2007. Her play, which we'll look a little bit at here, a monologue in verse, Don't Wake Me, The Ballad of Nihal Armstrong, ran in London, Edinburgh, New York, and 4 cities in India between 2012 and 2014, and was nominated for a number of awards. This is actually quite a condensed version of their bios, so if you want to hear more about them or read them, please go onto our website and just type in their names in Google, and you'll find some wonderful things about them. Now, before we get onto the meat of this talk, it's important for me to provide the background for why this talk is happening and what the public programme is about. We tend to think of public programmes, particularly in institutions, as sort of top-down things where we decide what a theme is and then all the events illustrate that theme. For us, this programme is very much a process of learning and thinking about the number of issues that we are exploring, and also for us as an institution to learn from the people that we invite and to really see it as a process of collaborative listening and working through some of the topics that we're engaging with. What is more is that this programme was really developed out of a very personal relationship with David, with whom we've had many discussions about interdependence and care, allyship and solidarity. And we'll be talking about the personal being the political and the importance of allyship in this talk. One of the reasons why we wanted to create this program is because I have, and I think many of us have seen how there has been a very powerful ideology of individualism and competition, which is a kind of global phenomenon. And the impact on that, on practices of care and solidarity in forms of political movement, and also practices of art, have been very profound. In this context, ideas of success are less about human flourishing and how we can work together, but more predicated on the idea that my success is based on your failure. And I noticed even when we watch programs about dancing and singing, which we all enjoy, that in order for it to be valuable, it has to be turned into a competition. This ideology of individualism and competition has led to increasing divisions between people, but also between ourselves and our environment. And we can see how we now think of our natural environment as something to compete with and to exploit, rather than something in which we are embedded. The idea of interdependence, which comes between this, the idea of independence and dependency, is something about mutual support and recognizing that we all require, to varying degrees, forms of help. John Mbiti, a Kenyan Christian priest, said something very interesting about the concept of Ubuntu, which for me is a good definition of the idea of interdependence. He says, "I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am." And just to finish on this little introduction here, the reason why we're doing this program is to raise a discussion really about what care and interdependence means here locally in this context in Vilnius, but also to draw a range of different perspectives from people from all around the world, and not just from the arts, including law, activism, writing, and other domains. And we want to bring together these perspectives to think through these ideas, and I hope, I can see many of you in the audience are artists, I'm also some from curators or other institutions working here in Vilnius, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from people who are perhaps not necessarily in the arts, but in different domains. So, now I'm going to let David and Rahila do most of the talking, and I'm just going to guide the discussion a little bit. And I think, David, if you could start by giving a little introduction about who you are, and Rahila, if you could also talk about who you are and what you do, and then how we came together.
Thank you, Yates, and thanks for inviting us, and thank you for coming this afternoon on a Saturday. I mean, Yates has given a very full background and explanation, which I won't repeat, but I would say that my interest in this started as trying to make sense of my place in the world as a disabled child, as a child who was noticeably disabled. I was born in the 1960s in England, at the time a little bit different from now, but maybe not completely different, where attitudes and feelings were very catastrophic around disability. And growing up, I tried to make sense of it. I became an activist, and then a lawyer, as Yates mentioned, working in the field. And although I no longer practice law now, I do other things, except I'm an academic at Birkbeck as well. I've become very interested in the idea and concept of allyship, what it means for us to be there fully for each other, to be truly connected to each other across identities, regardless of whether we have the same or different identities. And particularly, what does that mean as a tool for liberation and progress? And as Yates mentioned, a lot of my thinking has been helped and evolved through conversations that he and I have had through our own relationship, but also through other conversations that I've had and thinking. And when I was a lawyer, I used to sue people, basically, that I litigated. So the tool that was available to me for resolving these problems was to sue people, to take people to court. And if I'm honest, I enjoyed it immensely. But I think that there is a place for that. But as a tool for systemic change, it's limited. So in terms of allyship and interdependence, as Yates mentioned, and what it means for us to have intrinsic, profound connections with each other across identities, is what I find fascinating now. And just to say, before I hand over to Rahila and I first met 30 years ago when I was in private practice, and Rahila instructed me to act for her and her son, Nihal, who you'll hear more about. So our relationship then originally was, as in my case, as the lawyer and my client. We came across each other by chance, really, through a mutual friend very recently, and that's how we got in touch. And Rahila sent me a piece she'd written, which I'm sure she'll talk more about, which I found very interesting and important. And here we are today.
And just to add that neither of us recognized each other when we met after 30 years at this party. It was only when somebody said that was David Rubin, and I went, oh my God, the David Rubin that I met 30 years ago. So basically, I've come to an understanding and engagement with disability politics because I had a son in 1984 who had cerebral palsy, and it was a really all-consuming form of motherhood that sort of took a lot of time, energy, investment. It took a lot of coming to terms with what it meant. And so Nihal, we spent a long time, spent all his life fighting for his right to be included in mainstream society. And it started with school because, school was always special needs school, and then we had a whole range of labels that were attached to it. So there was moderate learning difficulty, severe learning difficulty. And in my naivety, when he was ready to go to nursery, to the first school, I suggested to the local council who was responsible for making these decisions that I would want to send him to this particular school. It was called Mallory's, and he just laughed in my face. And he didn't even understand how cruel that laugh came across as, which was like, how could you even think about that? And so we went to, under pressure from the local authority, he went to a school for moderate learning difficulties, and the head teacher there absolutely hated the idea of having to include somebody as severe as Nihal, because he was not verbal, he was non-verbal. And she'd been used to having children with polio, with physical needs. She could deal with that. And she used Nihal in order to get more resources. I mean, this is a long and complicated and terrible sort of story, so I won't bore you with all the details, just to say that how these labels hung around Nihal's neck, and none of them defined him, or they defined him to such an extent that he couldn't really express his humanity. And throughout all this, despite the fact that I knew he had huge amount of difficulty expressing himself, we understood that he was intelligent. He would respond in a way that was, full of humor, and he would tease us. For example, I'm a terrible singer, and I used to try and sing to him to comfort him, and there was a particular Bob Marley song that I would sing, and he would pout, and he would start, to cry, and then it became a mock pout and mock tears, and the more I did it, the more he mock pouted, and he was only a few months old, and I thought, this baby isn't what the medical authorities are telling me about. Anyway, so that was kind of, he spent almost all his life fighting society, fighting for inclusion in a whole different number of ways, and that's when I came across David, because I wanted him to represent us, to get him into mainstream school, and he did finally get into mainstream school, so that was, the battle. And then he died at the age of 17, so that felt really kind of, it was quite a body blow, because you sort of feel like the one thing I forgot to do was to keep him alive. I sort of did everything else. So that's how, but whilst he was alive, I never got involved in disability politics, because I found it didn't feel like, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on, a good fit with the life that we were leading. But I was very active politically as a black woman, and anti-racist politics and feminist politics, which is what Yates was referring to through my membership of Southall Black Sisters. So a lot of the, I suppose, political perspectives that I've honed came from my time in Southall Black Sisters and other work that I've done with feminist organizations. So that's me.
Yeah, I think so. So I think, one, it's kind of amazing that you met 30 years ago, then at a party, then briefly for lunch in London, where we discussed doing this program, and now here at the National Gallery, which is great. And one, there are, in many ways, we come from very different backgrounds. And we, in the course of this talk, we want to think about how we can talk about our backgrounds, which might be very different, but find the points of relation between us. But before we do that, I think it's important for us to give a little bit of an explanation about the social model of disability. So Rahila has just talked about getting her son Nihal into mainstream schools, and the ways in which those mainstream schools would put up constant barriers to allowing Nihal to enter those schools, so that what was disabling was the structure of the school rather than so much Nihal's specific impairment. David, since you've done so much on the social model of disability, could you, just for everyone here, to give a brief outline of what it is and how and where it emerged from?
Sure. I think this is, I think I met some of you when I was here in Lithuania last time, and we talked about it then, so apologies for those of you for whom this is familiar. But the social model has been a key tool for liberation for disabled people around the world since its inception, probably in the 1970s onwards. There's a lot that one can say about it, but in a nutshell, in brief, it was a theoretical position that was developed against a backdrop which saw that, which focused on all of the problems that disabled people face being located within their bodies, within their medical or quasi-medical conditions. So the historic, what we would say the oppressive attitude towards disabled people is that is that they have a medical condition which is disadvantageous. And if that's the only basis for their problems, then the solution is to have for them to no longer have the medical condition. So to give an illustration, if the reason why somebody who uses a wheelchair is lonely or homeless or can't get a job or doesn't have any friends or is mistreated, if the reason for that is because they use a wheelchair, then the solution is to find a way where they don't use a wheelchair. What the social model said, very simply, was that is not the reason for all of those things. The reason for all of those things is society's response to them using a wheelchair, or in other words, oppression. So whereas the traditional, what we sometimes call medical or charity model, would say that the solution to the problem of loneliness and unemployment and so on is for there to be no more impairment, no more medical conditions, the social model said the solution to all of those things is to change society, to end discrimination, to promote and advance inclusion, and to end all practices which say that if you are disabled you don't belong and you can't do these things. Now, there's a lot more that can be said about that, and we will talk some more about that, because I think probably both Rahila and I think it's been very useful, but it's a limited way of understanding things, and we will say some more about it. But for those of us who were activists in the 80s and 90s, it was a transformative theoretical position. And from my point of view, it was the beginnings of my understanding that I was a fully fledged human, and therefore that my role, that I could have connections with everybody else. And just to bring back to the thematic area that Yeats described, I no longer wanted to be cared for. I wanted to be able to care for others as much as they do for me. And hence this idea of interdependence, which has been talked about in many ways for centuries by writers and artists and philosophers and theoreticians. Just to show a difference between impairment, which is the word that we often use to describe a medical and quasi-medical condition, and disability, which is the word we use to describe the oppression. Intrinsic factors or impairment might be what the medical condition, how severe it is, and the impact on you individually, whereas external factors, which is the oppression, would be the physical environment. If you're a wheelchair user or a blind person or someone with another kind of impairment, does the environment prevent you from accessing it? Do the social arrangements and structures exclude you? Are there expectations and roles which mean that you don't belong or you're not able to participate? And are there cultural meanings and representations which impact on that? None of which are to do with the medical condition. I'll hand over to Rahila.
Yeah, so I think for me, the social model was also very liberating because of that shift of focus from the individual to the institution. So all the battles that I've been fighting with schools, where the focus was all the time on what Nihal can and can't achieve, it was a great liberation to be able to say, well, you're wrong. It's not about what my child can't achieve, but that he should be part of the local school community, and that's the end of the conversation. But why I felt it was limited. I mean, so for example, yes, a person in a wheelchair cannot participate in a meeting because there are no ramps to that room. But at the end of the day, there are no ramps to the Himalayan mountains. In the sense that there was a point at which society could meet you more than halfway. But what if your disability doesn't allow you to even meet get to that halfway point, or we don't even have to define it at what point, but there is a point at which there is pain, there is suffering, there is inability. And I think I felt that for my son, if we used, let's say, splinting to open up his fingers, to we used a variety of things to make him more comfortable. We did physiotherapy. When was it medicalized? Which bit of it was medicalized? Which bit of it should I have frowned on? And there was a sense, and this is why I've kind of steered clear of disability politics, because I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing, because was I actually trying to make Nihal some sort of shape him into a more perfect version of himself, and was that wrong? And at what point did it blur from comfort, from his comfort, to me seeking some sort of a cure? Where was the medicalization process? So that was my discomfort with the sort of social model, although I totally buy into and believe that's a really important shift, that focus from the disabled, impaired individual to the institution that disables him. I wanted space to be able to express my grief as the mother of a disabled child, and I felt it wasn't there. I mean, since I've met David, so I think his position is much more nuanced, but I think when I was bringing up my son, I was interacting with those sections of the disability movement, which was very reluctant to make space for a mother's grief, because it was somehow a reflection and a comment on that child on disability. So it was a very difficult road to tread. And I think I've become more involved in disability politics or thinking around the issues after he died than when he was alive, really.
So I think something that we've been talking about is how you can have a conversation about specific impairments on the left, and the realities of the experience of those impairments without contributing to oppressive or prejudicial narratives about disability. And I know this is something that is a key part of your work as well. How do you, what's your experience of this?
I think, well, there's lots that we can say. I think that there are stages in liberation, and I remember when I talk about coming out as a disabled person, because that was the point in the 1980s where I read a particular profound and transformative book called Pride Against Prejudice, Transforming Attitudes to Disability, which is a time when I first got to understand this idea of a social model. And I met other disabled people who are also activists, but for me it was a uniquely different environment. All other times I've been with disabled people is because we have been excluded. We've been sent to special day centres, or we've been sent to special schools, or I've met them in hospital. There were always particular environments because there was something wrong with us. Whereas in this case, we met each other through a sense of fierce resistance and activism. And for me, that was a coming out, and I remember at the time beginning to feel pride in myself as a disabled person for those reasons. But I think that's the start of a journey. I don't think it's a static position. I think you move on, and Rahila and Yates and I have talked about nuanced positions and complexity. I'm not sure that I'm answering your question.
Well, I think this question of pride is important because it's there, as you all know, there is gay pride and there's also black pride and disability he writes, and this is something that Rahila quoted, "It is harder to celebrate disability than it is to celebrate blackness or gay pride or being a woman. Disability pride is problematic because disability is difficult to recuperate as a concept, as it refers either to limitation and incapacity, or else to oppression and exclusion, or to both." Now, what are your feelings on this? And because I know you have a range of different feelings about Tom's quote here and about pride.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you know, when we were talking about this, I thought, well, all the things that I've been politically active in, like, say, as a black woman, I've never really bought into the concept of black pride. I mean, what does it mean? You know, if I think about all the campaigns that I've been involved in, every time we won some important campaign, some demand, there was pride in that moment. There was pride in the fact that we had embarked on something really difficult and we had won it. I sort of, the notion of pride, I understand where it comes from. I understand how important it is to have a sense of self-esteem because it's been knocked out of you for, you know, over centuries of discrimination, exploitation, oppression. So I understand where it comes from, but I feel that pride overstates it. I feel that it swings in the opposite direction. And in some ways, it was this kind of glorification of disability that took place as part of that whole thing of pride. You know, how can you admit to not wanting your disability because that would be politically defeatist. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to change society and you're trying to change the institutions that disable you. How can you then admit to the fact that you would rather not have this disability, where not everybody, there are lots of, I've come across many disabled people who say it's the best thing that happened to me. You quoted somebody, I came across a TED talk by a woman, an Iraqi woman whose house was bombed and she lost her leg, and she gives a number of TED talks and goes and she says it's the best thing that happened to me.
And why? Because you have a good example of why, for Adam, your friend, why it was the best thing that happened to him.
So my friend, I'm a big football fan, and I'm a season ticket holder at Arsenal, which is a club. This is the point where you all go, hooray!
Only
or we don't care. I go to football matches with my friend Adam, who's a wheelchair user, and he became disabled at the age of 17 through a motorcycle accident. So he wasn't born disabled. Unlike me, he wasn't born disabled. And he is paralysed from the chest down, so he's a wheelchair user. He says, if people say to him, you know, what would your life have been like if you hadn't had the motorcycle accident, or would you rather it not have happened, or assuming that to be the case? And he will say, you know, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. And I find, if I speak for him accurately, it's because he says his whole life and worldview and understanding of himself as a human and his relationship with other people has expanded enormously as a consequence of that, because it's had to make him challenge, you know, he's a white, heterosexual, middle class, which in Britain is a significant identity, man, and his whole worldview has changed as a result of being disabled, and for him that has been an enriching experience. Now, I can well understand you could take a converse view, and just on the question of pride, if I may say so, I think it's a pendulum issue. I think you start off from the position where you are significantly oppressed, and I think what's critical to understand is oppression is internalized by people. So if everybody tells you that you're wrong, not only is that a terrible thing, but what's even worse is that you believe it. To varying degrees, sometimes you can resist the belief and sometimes you can't, but you believe that about yourself. So for me, the issue of pride is about a reclaiming of your sense of pride in yourself. And that might mean ignoring some aspects of the detrimental, painful issues that some impairments may have. But it's part of a journey. In the end, what does liberation look like? For me, it looks like where these identities, which are all constructed anyway, become just small, relatively insignificant facts about us. I happen to have the particular impairment I do, but it's only one of a number of things about me. It's not my identity. This is ultimately, I think, where I'm aiming for. So it's a pendulum where you start with one end, where you feel terrible about yourself, or you're made to feel terrible about yourself, to the other end, which you can talk about being proud as a counterpoint to the first, before you can then end up in the middle, if you like. And I think the middle bit, getting to the middle bit, is about alliances and interdependency.
So a comment to that. So what Rahila was saying is that the issue, as I understand, the issue with pride, or what can happen with pride, is that it can essentialize an identity. That your entire identity becomes about having a particular impairment or being gay, rather than the whole set of things that make us a human being. And in this swinging in the kind of the trajectory of activism that one of the movements is to kind of move towards pride, and maybe that also involves a level of separatism, would you say? But as long as that's not the goal, I mean, you must have this experience.
Well, I was just going to say, maybe this is the time to show that clip.
Yes.
Because just to introduce it, because since we're talking about pride and the different kind of meanings of it, this is a 1 minute or 1.5 minute clip from a dramatic monologue I wrote after my son died, which is a mother telling her son the story of his life. And the son is represented by an empty wheelchair. It just, I think, encapsulates that quite well.
It's until
51, 32.
Okay.
It's all
Yeah.
It's just a little earlier. So it's 50, 59. 59.
I don't think we got sound. We had sound earlier.
You were entering adolescence. Didn't expect you to be a wild teen, but I did expect your bud to bloom, vibrant colours to explode from the green. Only, when you turned 16, they found your spine was in a twist, subverting its own function, a fifth columnist. We will do an op, said the doc, ever the optimist. As the waiting list was quite long, a plastic body brace would be moulded to your design to keep your spine in place. It fitted snugly. Found myself hugging a carapace. Now, you went to bed locked in a brace, going from man to robot. The thought, wish it wasn't so, crept into my head unasked. Grief is a betrayal of the cause, pressure to be cheerful, masked all truths, disability glowed, glorious light in which it basked. All political movements start like that, overstating their case, correcting eons of contempt. But disabled and proud left no room for disabled and pissed off. One day, there will be space.
I'll put up the text as well. So, I mean, I think there would be a reaction to that would be, I mean, you've talked about, maybe it's worth talking a little bit more about the role of grief and how we can, and because this is a good illustration of where disability pride or pride in an identity can not allow other emotions or other feelings to come through. Yeah. Could you give me a little background about this particular passage?
Well, actually, this was exactly, these were the words that I don't think I could utter to even other mothers of disabled children. Because we all maintained this pretense between us that everything was fine, we would rail against the institutions, we would rail against all those people who made life tough for us, but we would never admit to the fact that we were feeling pulled down by the whole situation of care. We couldn't bring ourselves to admit it to each other. I couldn't, and certainly not to another disabled person, because it felt like a comment on them, on their existence, even at an individual level. And at a political level, as I say, I was involved in those parts of the disability movement, which had not got to that, maybe the middle level that you're talking about, that nuanced position. I mean, I sort of make reference in this to that all political movements begin like this. I remember in the early days of the feminist movement, we never talked about, we would never criticize our mothers, because mothers can never be wrong. They could never be violent. They could never have destroyed your life, for example. You could talk about your father. But we now will talk about mothers, if in terms of black people, the kind of black nationalism that is the other end is part of the black pride. We hate those people in that part, those sort of politics, hate all white people, because all white people are responsible for racism, or they benefit from it anyway, even if they are not themselves racist. Those are the kind of extreme positions in which it's very hard to present nuance. And I think politics itself, if you think about the demands, you think about a slogan, whenever you're on a march, you think about a slogan, it has to be short and catchy and brief. Cannot capture the nuance of the whole movement. You've got to stick with the focus of it. And I think so therefore, literature, art, allows you perhaps that space to explore it, so that you're not feeding into those negative narratives, those narratives of prejudice. That's the big question. How do you do all of this without then feeding into social prejudice and discrimination which exists? So in front of people who express directly disablest attitudes, you've got to be, no, he was like this, and it was wonderful, and it was all of this. You have to talk in those terms in order to challenge that narrative. But that narrative doesn't allow you to express your whole reality. So that's...
I mean, there's nothing about what Regula's just said which I would disagree with at all, actually. So, and there's lots that we can say. I think the disability movement is on, like all of us, it's on a journey, and the absolutist positions that were taken in the 80s and 90s, not just in the UK, but in many other countries as well, I think that they are much more nuanced and evolving, and each one of us is on a different place. But this always leads me to, well, what is it to be? How do you present yourself to other people when you're still trying to reach a point? And this, for me, is what allyship, what is about. So what this is, whether I want to be an ally to women around sexism and male domination, or whether I want other people to be an ally to me as a disabled person, it has to be about, I mean, I think there's no other way of putting it, but complete, profound connection to each other. So where you see each other as fully and completely as you can, and you make a decision to back each other in that way, as you are.
So I think this is an important, because you brought up, Rahila, also that different ways of expressing forms of resistance or the journey of a political movement. And one of them is, you've written written journalistic pieces, you've written this ballad, you've written screenplays, and I think there's one important aspect is also the forms of activism that you engage in, and that to recognise the importance of keep using different perspectives and different ways of articulating a liberation movement or process. And both of you have been, both of you are very prominent activists, and you've engaged in activism in different ways. And could you speak, maybe both of you, your experiences of, before we get on to allyship, because I want to end on that, but before, your experiences of activism and the kinds of language that you've used for it, whether it's, and also the limitations of them. So you've worked in law, and so what are the limitations of law? What are the opportunities or the limitations offered by performance or artwork in activism?
Well, in terms of law, if depends on who you are, but law is great fun. You can, and as I mentioned, I sue people, so I litigate. But the limitations of equality law, and this is in the whole of Europe, because much of equality law is now the same across, I was going to say members of the EU, I'm slightly shamefaced about what I say now, coming from the country that I do. But most of our law, not all of it, but a lot of our law is very similar. But I would say that even equality law is framed within a capitalist construct, because it gives us all rights not to be disadvantaged within a competition. So if you go for a job, one of you will get the job and somebody else won't, and you shouldn't be disadvantaged in that competition about who gets the job. Now that's correct. You shouldn't be disadvantaged because of being a woman or a black person or a disabled person. But it's a limited ambition. And although I enjoyed litigating a lot, I was only ever attaining individual solutions for individual people. Sometimes you could have a greater impact through strategic litigation, it's true, but it was within the confines of what the law permitted. There is a whole, which we haven't got time to go into today, but a whole other area of jurisprudence, human rights jurisprudence, which is about equality of dignity, which I find much more interesting. But basically the law is a floor, not a ceiling. I think there's a lot more that can be done. And for me now, in this current period of my life, it's about interdependence and allyship.
So for me, in terms of my artistic work, my writing, for me my writing is, I'm doing politics through another means. That's for me what my writing represents. And so I'm always looking for a form that is popular. The ballad, with its rhyme scheme, it used to be an oral form that could be remembered and sung at street corners and to a wide number of people. I chose that particularly because part of the popularity of an artistic form also depends on the extent to which it reconfirms or affirms the value system of the audience. So, whatever the current racist stereotypes might be, which make people laugh. So if you think about a television comedy or something and all the kind of stereotypes of women or disabled people or black people, it's getting better. That popularity of that program would be undermined by it questioning or going against society's prejudices. So I didn't want to do both things. If I'm trying to introduce a whole kind of way of thinking around disability, which is what I try to do with my ballad, I wanted to at least make the form accessible. This is a discussion I've worked in collaboration with a number of different artists, and we have this discussion quite a lot about whether you work to get the meaning from a piece of art, or whether it should be accessible. And I feel that if you want to mobilize a large number of people to your political cause, the art form should be totally accessible. So I've used always things like soap or ballad, or the film. Film is quite kind of universal medium, particularly say in countries like India where people are not literate or they have low levels of literacy. So the film that you were talking about, it was not just looking at domestic violence, but it was looking at a woman who killed her husband who was violent, which took the whole debate around violence to another level, because people were just getting used to the idea that if you were facing domestic violence, it was okay for you to leave your husband, but to kill him took the whole debate, because it was film, and because they were able to find, India's Bollywood superstar to take the role of the main character. It went into every village, every town. There was a discussion taking place up and down India around domestic violence. We reached the corners that we could never have reached as a small political group in London, in Britain. So if it had been artistically, aesthetically inaccessible, that would be two barriers to cross, whereas I'd rather just challenge the audience in terms of the content and the politics of it.
I think we're going to have, because there are lots of artists in the audience, and I'm sure they're going to ask questions about, well, I hope, about art and activism and the forms of art and activism. But related to that is what is the aim? And I think this is something that we can end on. And what is the aim of being an ally and allyship for both of you? Because we've talked about these trajectories of the journeys of liberation movements. And in both of your careers and practices, what is it about being an ally or finding allies that is important, and what's the kind of result that you're looking for?
Well, for me, there are several aims. One is that you accelerate liberation. You bring people together around a common ambition. The second is that I think it goes to the core of who we are as humans, or what we are as humans, and this idea that we thrive with each other. And Jane Campbell, who's a very well-known disabled activist in England, she talks about it in a slightly different context, about those times when there's a whole big debate around assisted suicide, about whether disabled people should be supported in killing themselves if they're under intense, if they feel, or people at the end of their lives. And it's a controversial thing for lots of reasons, but including from some disabled people, they oppose that. And she's one of them, and she will say, at that time that I feel that I am so tired of life because of maybe my struggles, physical struggles, or pain, or whatever, I don't want my allies to say, here's the tablets. I want them to tell me why they want me around. That's just one example. But I think the final thing I'll say is, there is an idea that all of these, we've talked about things very personally, but I think probably Rahila and I both understand oppression as being structural. And you can't really end disability oppression, in my view, disability oppression, until you've ended racism and sexism and homophobia.
So you quoted Martin Luther King, who said, none of us are free unless all of us are free.
So for me, the allyship is about reaching for that.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that you've said. I think two more things that I might like to add to that. One is that seeking of allies from a disabled person is a refreshing change from my experience of it, because in the past, and there was some truth to this, that actually carers were kept very much out of the disability movement because they had been historically oppressive, had shut down on the opportunities and the possible freedoms of those in their care. So they were not seen as useful allies in any shape or form. So that's welcoming, that shift in disability activism and political thought, that our future, our way forward is along with other people who have our interests at heart or who support our goals or whatever it may be. So that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, what we are also doing in this is that we have been, some parts of the political movement have been so pulled down into a sense of the authenticity of their identity and their identity politics, that only I can talk about my oppression as a black woman, not you, because you're not black. And I think that's been such a cul-de-sac, and it's been has had such a negative impact. So for example, I come off a public stage and a white woman will come up to me because I've criticized the hijab, and she will say, I'm so glad you did that, because I don't think I could do that without coming across as racist. And I say, but you should be able to talk about it. And what they don't recognize is that in a different context, because I'm born a Hindu, and this is a Muslim issue, and in a country like India, if I was to say that, I could be, if it was being framed by identity politics, would be criticized as a Hindu for criticizing a Muslim tradition, because Hindus and Muslims are, at loggerheads in India. So what I'm trying to say is that this sense of only I can talk on my behalf, because only I have faced the oppression that I have faced. And you'll find no two black women will have the same solution. So where does identity politics then lead us? So this coming together on political values, on an understanding that is structural, and not being located only in our individual issues. Because if all of these things surface from the system within which we live, then it's a system that we've got to bring to an end in some shape or form. And the only way we can do it is by the strength of numbers, by us collectively identifying all of the things that we face and fighting to end it.
That's a really beautiful place to end, I think, because the theme throughout has been that the need to come together and move beyond identities which essentialize us or reduce us to just about one identity, which can get in the way of forms of collaboration or looking at allies in one another.